This month's podcasts are sponsored by Aubergine Legal. Do you sometimes worry that your business isn't meeting all its legal compliance requirements and wonder if you're ticking all the legal boxes? Are you losing sleep worrying about a piece of legislation that you may or may not be complying with? Perhaps you need some help with your client contracts or your data protection compliance. Or maybe you're worried that your website doesn't have the right documents or legal notices in the right place. Perhaps you have a brand that you want to protect with a trademark. How about if you could outsource it all and eliminate all of your worries? If so, then get in touch with Aubergine Legal, a friendly commercial legal consultancy offering practical and clear commercial legal advice without the overwhelming legal jargon, taking the worry away and helping you to protect your business and minimise your risks. Aubergine offers a free 30-minute consultation if you have any questions or want to find out if they can help, and you can access this link and book your free 30-minute call via the link in the show notes. Welcome to the Bring Your Product Idea to Life podcast. This is the podcast for you if you're getting started selling products or if you'd like to create your own product to sell. I'm Vicky Weinberg, a product creation coach and Amazon expert. Every week, I share friendly, practical advice as well as inspirational stories from small businesses. Let's get started. Hello. Today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Clare Veal, a freelance commercial solicitor qualified for over 20 years who advises businesses on a range of commercial matters. So Clare is an expert in all things law for e-commerce and, well, all kinds of businesses. And I invited her on to answer all the questions that I had and some of the questions that you had regarding how to stay compliant when running a products business. So I fired a whole load of questions at Clare. She was very patient and very conscientious in how she answered them, and I hope you find this episode really useful. I will say right at the top, when we get into this, please don't be worried about all of the things that we cover, because you may hear Clare talking about things that you didn't know you needed to do or things you think, oh, I haven't checked that. Please don't worry. As Clare explains, the majority of us will be compliant and we will be doing everything right. And if we're not, there'll be a really simple fix for it. So this definitely isn't an episode to worry you. If you're starting out now, it's a really good way of making sure you start right and you've got everything set up to be compliant right from the outset. And if you've been in business for a while, maybe this is just an opportunity to just have a quick check and just go through and say, okay, have I done this? Have I done this? And am I compliant in the ways that I need to be? So yeah, not to scare anyone. This should be a really useful episode. Clare was fantastic, so helpful. And I really hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you do have any questions once you get to the end, then I will be including information on how you can reach out to Clare as well. So I would love to now introduce you to Clare. So hi Clare, thank you so much for joining me.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me along. I'm delighted to be here today.
Oh, I'm delighted that you're here. Can we please start by giving an introduction to yourself, your business and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Clare Veal. I'm a qualified freelance solicitor. I've been running my own legal consultancy, which is Aubergine Legal, for the last 6 years. And I specialise in commercial law, which includes all things related to e-commerce and selling to businesses and consumers. But I also have expertise in intellectual property matters. So that's anything to do with trademarks or copyrights. So things like your brand and your content. And also the delightful topic of data protection and privacy. So that's sort of me, my legal background. On a personal level, I live in a little town called Hazelmere, which is right at the bottom of Surrey, with my husband and my 2 sons.
Amazing, thank you. So I've invited you here today to cover off lots of legal questions that we have for our listeners about selling mainly online. So can we start with, what are some of the things that are covered by e-commerce law? What are some of the things that as business owners we need to consider?
Well, so e-commerce law is quite a big topic. It's broken down into lots of different pieces of legislation. So, for example, there are rules for how you should be dealing with consumers online. Then there are rules for the actual e-commerce experience, like, for example, when you should be displaying your T's and C's and, the information you need to give people about your products and prices. And then there are also the rules on data protection and privacy. So basically, anybody who's selling products or services online, they need to be thinking about designing their online presence and their sales processes to comply with all of these laws. And there's three key. Well, actually, there's four key pieces of legislation. There's the Consumer Rights Act, which deals with all the rights that consumers have when buying or buying goods or services online. Then the second one is the Consumer Contracts Regulations, which sets out all of the information that you as a seller need to display before a customer actually buys your products. Then there's some consumer protection unfair trading regs, which basically stops you from doing anything naughty, nothing misleading or any aggressive sales practices. And then finally, there's the e-commerce regulations, which kind of overlaps a little bit with the consumer contracts regulations in there. It sets out all of the information you have to give people before they actually pay their money and buy the item. Actually, there's a fifth one as well. There's a Data Protection Act as well.
Wow, that's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, there is a lot to consider.
Okay, well, we're going to try and break it down and make it super simple for everyone, Claire. So I'm going to start out with the first thing you mentioned was the e-commerce process. So I guess that's how the website functions and how people actually make a purchase. So what are some of the things that people need to consider here, please?
So the first thing I suppose you need to be thinking about is, who are your customers? If they're going to be consumers, so individuals, then you have to bear in mind all of the consumer law requirements. So for that, you need to be crystal clear to your customers about what you're selling, what the price is, any delivery times, what your refund policies are, and so on. And so when you're setting up your website and your e-commerce experience, you must be making sure that you're ticking all of those boxes and including all of that information. Now, some of the regulations do require you to display quite a bit of information before the customer actually buys the goods or services. And so people deal with this by having a set of T's and C's for dealing with the sale of the goods or the services. So it'd be things like, you have to tell people who you are, the name of your company or your trading name, your contact details, your address. You need to tell people things like whether you're VAT registered. And then there's all the information about the goods and services you're selling, what it is, how much it costs, and so on. And so people deal with, complying with the laws by having all of this information in their T's and C's. So I suppose that's the key thing to think about when you're setting up your online shop.
Okay, that's helpful. And I'm guessing that a lot of website builders nowadays, so Shopify, for example, a lot of this is built in. I mean, you do need to customize, I guess, your terms and conditions and your policies so they're relevant to your business.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because, one business might be selling tickets for an event and another business might be selling, webinars, or somebody else might be selling an actual physical goods. All of those they're all selling online, but they're quite different things that are being sold. So you have to definitely, you can definitely use those templates provided by Wix and Shopify and and all the others, but definitely tailor them for your business and for the things that you are actually selling, because otherwise they just won't make sense.
That makes sense. Thank you. And when we're thinking about terms and conditions, what would you do if, let's say, you need to write terms and conditions, but you're completely stuck in what to include? Is there anywhere we can go and easily check what needs to be in them, just so we can make sure we're staying compliant?
Yeah, so people can sort of go online and buy templates, legal templates for this. Which is fine as long as you read them properly and you fill them in properly and tailor it to your business. Or you can use somebody like me. I can help, I do help lots of businesses draft their terms and conditions, because there is a lot of information that you have to remember to include in your terms and conditions. You can have a go at writing them yourselves, but sometimes it's best to get it checked to make sure that you've got all of that pre-contract information that you need to have in there is definitely in there.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you. So I'm assuming that as long as you've got your terms and conditions set up and they've either been done professionally, you've had them checked, then the other information, so what the product is, the product price, etc., that's going to be on your product pages. So in terms of your website, you should be covered with the basics if you've done that.
Yeah, so if you're setting up your website, obviously the first thing to do is to have all your pages set up where you're, advertising your products or your services, make sure that that contains all of the information about the product, the price, how it's delivered. If it's like an online course, you'd need to tell people how to dial in and all of that stuff. And then, so that's the first step. And then the second step is making sure your T's and C's tie in with that. And this is really important. The T's and C's have to be agreed by the customer before they actually make the payments. Now, I've seen some websites where the payment, the e-commerce experience doesn't have the tick box to agree to the T's and C's anywhere. And the T's and C's are just displayed on the page, but you definitely need to get your customers to tick that box before they can actually go on to make the payment. In fact, really your website should be set up to not allow the customer to pay until they've ticked that box.
That is such a good point. Thank you. And actually, I bought something online recently and noticed I had to tick that box. And and that makes perfect sense now as to why that always pops up.
Yeah,
that's good to know. And I do think, again, to reassure people, most of the e-commerce website builders, so using Shopify again, this is something that's built in, so the functionality will already be there. It was just making sure that your terms and conditions are relevant to your business and you're not just using the template that they popped in there already.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, just read it all properly. And sometimes there might be some clauses in there which don't apply to you, and you can remove them. If your business is selling something sort of quite bespoke, something different, you might need to add some extra bits in. So, by all means, use those templates, but make sure they definitely work for you and your business.
Brilliant, thank you. And so most of my audience are selling physical products, but let's just touch very quickly on digital products. Is there anything else we need to think about if we're selling digital products?
So, actually, before we go on to that, I probably should just quickly mention that not only do you need the terms and conditions for selling goods and services, you also need to have on your website a set of website terms, conditions, and a privacy policy. So all of these will apply to goods, services, and digital products. So just remember to have all of those documents in place. Then, for selling digital products, you, as well as having all the documents in place, you need to make sure that you've got some kind of protections in place for the actual content in your digital products. So, because the content in there is all going to be your copyright. So make sure you include copyright legends to tell the world that it's your work. If you're selling digital products, maybe it's like a digital course and you might be using parts of other people's work, make sure you have all the permissions in place. Then for the terms and conditions, there's going to be a slight difference here in that this is a digital product. And so the usual cancellation rights that consumers get. So if you're buying something, if you're buying a good or service online as a consumer, you get a 14-day cooling off period. However, if you're buying a digital download product, that cancellation right won't apply. And the key point here is that you need to tell people this, especially if they're consumers, you need to remind them. So you need to put it into your T's and C's. Some businesses even go a step further and have a little separate notice on the actual purchase page, making it crystal clear that once they've made their payment, then they won't be entitled to a refund once the download has started. So that's the key thing to think about with selling digital products.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So Claire, you've mentioned consumer rights a few times so far in the conversation. Can you just talk us through some of the rights that consumers have and how we ensure that as sellers we're compliant with them, please?
Yeah, sure. So as I've already mentioned, that they have the rights to all of those pre-contract information. So like I've already mentioned, make sure your websites display everything up front before they purchase, and before they tick that box and make that payment. All the information must have been displayed to them. Then we've just touched on the cooling off period, cancellation rights. So consumers definitely have that right. So, this is applicable for any sort of goods or services sold at a distance. However, there are some exceptions. We've just mentioned downloadable content, digital items, but there are also other exceptions where consumers won't be entitled to this cooling off period. That would include things like booking a hotel room, renting a vehicle. You don't have a cooling off period for those. For things like bespoke items. So if somebody's ordered something and people are making something bespoke for a customer, then the cooling off period doesn't apply. And things like catering and leisure activities, like theatre tickets, weddings, all of those kind of things don't entitle the customer to a cooling off period. So that's one thing to kind of bear in mind. The other right is obviously consumers, if they're buying goods or services, they do have a right to a full refund beyond the 14-day cooling off period if an item is faulty or not described or doesn't do what it's supposed to do, or if the service isn't up to standards. So there is that refund right as well.
Thank you. And are there any exceptions to the refund right? Because, for example, I'm imagining, let's say you're selling pierced earrings or underwear, maybe. Are there certain products where you can stipulate there are no returns, or can anyone stipulate no returns for anything?
No, you can't stipulate. Yeah, those examples you've mentioned. Yeah, you can't. You don't have to give a refund for them. Sometimes it's at the discretion of the seller. But yeah, like I said, if an item is faulty or not as described, or if they buy online and it's within that 14 days, then yes, you definitely have to give a refund. Say if somebody went into a shop, say if you went into a shop and you bought a red jumper and you took it home, I think you have 30 days that you can get a refund if you change your mind. But beyond that, if you simply decide that you wanted a blue jumper, not a red one, but there was actually nothing wrong with the product, then actually the shop doesn't have to give you a refund. It's just that it's quite usual in this country for shops to have quite flexible and favourable refund policies for customers as part of their customer service. So yeah, you should check. You don't always have to give a refund if somebody just changes their mind.
That's really interesting. And so that's for selling online, did you say that was 14 days?
Yeah, so for 14 days, customers, they can change their mind for whatever reason, and you have to honour that. Unless, of course, it falls within one of those things that we just mentioned, the exceptions, like theatre tickets or digital downloads.
Okay, and is there somewhere that people can go and find out what the exceptions are?
Yes. So if you just Google, the .gov website has got a page on it, and also trading standards also have a page about it as well. If you like, I can send you the links later and you can share them to your network.
That would be amazing. Thank you. What we'll do is we'll put those links in the show notes. That might be interesting, because I've certainly bought products where I've been told before I bought them, this can't be returned for whatever reason. And some of them have been products out. So I'm not asking because I've got a vendetta against anyone. I'm just genuinely curious, because I am thinking there might be people thinking that they don't have to offer refunds, but they actually do, or perhaps they're offering refunds where legally they maybe don't have to. So I think it's just a good check for people to do, really.
Yeah, and actually these links that I send you, anybody who's selling online should definitely have a read of these anyway, because it would be really useful to read this information when you're devising your refund policy, because you need to make sure you're following the right side of the law. And by reading these links will definitely help you, because everything's different depending on what you're selling. So yeah, have a good read.
Yeah, that'd be really helpful. Thank you. So we'll link to those in the show notes. And let's now talk a little bit about data protection, which is another right that consumers obviously have. Well, we all have. What do we need to do to make sure we're compliant here? Because obviously if we're taking payments and orders online, then obviously we're holding a lot of customer data, or we're at least processing customer data. What do we need to do here, Claire?
So yeah, you're quite right. Any online shop needs to comply with data protection laws, because you are taking people's names, their payment details, their address as well. So the first thing to do is to make sure you're familiar with the general data protection principles. So this is things like, make sure you only collect data that you actually need. So, don't collect someone's date of birth if you don't really need to know how old they are. Then make sure that you're only keeping the data for as long as is necessary. That's the legal position. So don't hold on to, loads of customer data if you don't really need it. And for the data that you are holding on to, make sure that you've got an actual reason for keeping that data. And also make sure you keep all the data safe and secure. Because if you were doing something wrong, you would just need to be able to justify and explain to the ICO why you were doing something in a particular way. So on that point, the ICO, if anybody doesn't know, is the Information Commissioner's Office, and they're a government body which looks after data protection. On their website, it's super useful. They have a whole section for businesses and organisations, and there's loads of tips and information on there as to what you need to do when setting up and running your business to stay compliant with the laws. So I think the first step is maybe go onto the ICO's website, have a look, get familiar with what you're supposed to be doing. Then, secondly, you should put in place a privacy policy for your business. Now, by having a privacy policy, you're going to be ticking a lot of the boxes already for complying with data protection laws. So your privacy policy needs to tell people, who you are, how people can contact you, and then you need to set out in detail all of the information that you're collecting about people, how you're going to be using that data, if you're going to be sharing it with anybody, and your justifications for why you're using it all. If you fill in your privacy policy properly, then you're probably about 90% of the way of being data protection compliant anyway. And then there's two other things to think about here with data protection. The first one is that you also need to remember that cookies on your website are also seen as a form of personal data. And in the UK, there are laws which require people who have a website to tell their website users what cookies are being used on their website, and then explain what the cookies do, and then provide information about the reasons why they're there. And at the moment, this might change soon, but at the moment, UK laws also require website operators to have a little cookie pop-up notice the first time a website visitor visits a website. You might have seen these annoying pop-up notices.
Yeah.
And the point of that is that people have to agree to any non-essential cookies that are used on the website. But there's a little glimmer of hope here in that there is a new piece of data protection law going through Parliament at the moment. And if it gets passed, then they will be getting rid of this annoying cookie pop-up requirement. Then the final thing to think about with data protection is that you need to, as a business, if you're collecting personal data about people, you need to register with the ICO. So all organisations have to pay this fee once a year. I think it's £35 or £40 at the moment. Basically, it acts like a data protection tax. So you pay this money, and then the Information Commissioner's Office uses that money to help provide guidance to businesses, and they also use that money to investigate data security breaches. But if you don't pay that fee, then they might ask you why you haven't paid and remind you to do so. They do sometimes do little audits. They go through Companies House and they check the companies have all paid their fees. So it's definitely something you need to do.
That's really useful to know. I actually, though, remember this was a long time ago, Claire, getting a notification about that. But there was something, and I can't remember what the thing was. There was a reason I didn't have to pay it, and I cannot think what that reason was. It was a reason they gave me when I phoned them to check. Do you have any idea what that might have been?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, they do have different levels of fees for different types of businesses. I think charities pay less, for example. It might be that you weren't actually collecting data about people. I don't know.
What does count? That's a good question, actually. So what's classified as customer data?
So, they call it personal data. Basically, it's any data that will identify somebody as an actual living human being. So, for example, Clare Veal and my home address, all of that is personal data because it all relates to me. But if you were just referring to me as Clare in Surrey, then that wouldn't be seen as personal data because there's more than one Clare in Surrey. So that wouldn't actually link back to me as an individual. So yes, it'd be things like people's names, their addresses, email, telephone number, bank details. Even, as I mentioned, the cookies, because people can track an actual person by the use of a cookie because it links to their laptop. So it's basically the key thing to remember. It's anything that will identify you as an actual person.
That's really good to know. And do we need to give customers the option to opt out here? Because I've noticed that very often now, if you buy something from an online shop, you do have the option of checking a box if you don't want them to save your details, or you don't want them to pass your details on to a third party. Is that a legal requirement to have that on your website?
Yeah, so in your privacy policy, you do have to set out to people what their rights are with respect to their data. And one of people's rights is the right to have their data deleted. But you don't have to have that opt out button, but you do have to have information in your privacy policy telling people what their rights are. And then if somebody asks you to do that, then you would have to act immediately. So yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you. And are we able to use customer data for marketing? And the reason I ask this, I know that something that's really popular is to use customers' email addresses to build an email address to then market to or send newsletters or whatever it is. Are we allowed to do this?
Yes, so you can freely add your customers' data to your newsletter list without even getting them to opt in or get their permission, on the provision that it is for marketing to them for similar types of, well, the same types of goods and services. So, for example, if I went onto your website and, or if somebody came onto my website and bought some of my legal templates, I can add them to my newsletter list and I can send them marketing about other legal services I'm providing. However, I wouldn't be able to use those email addresses to tell them about my new sort of side business. So, for example, say if I set up a gardening business in my spare time, then I wouldn't be able to send an email to them, telling them about my new gardening business because they originally got in contact with me about legal things. So there's that. That's the first thing. So you can freely market people for the same type of services and goods. If you want to market people for other things, then you would need to get them to opt in. And then the final thing to remember here is, regardless of how you got them onto your list, every time you send them a piece of marketing, you do have to give them the option to unsubscribe. So you need to have that little link to allow them to come off of your newsletter list if they don't want to receive any more marketing.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And again, for people, for peace of mind, I think most of the sort of mail software, so MailerLite and MailChimp, that's built in automatically. So
yes.
And also, I know that when I add people to my own mail software, I also get a little pop-up asking me if I have permission to add people to the list as well. So I think a lot of the mail services have this kind of thing built into them now.
Yeah.
In case anyone's worried whether they're doing this, you probably are doing it and you just don't realize.
Yeah. That's the beauty of using those providers. But I mean, I think the key thing to remember here is try to remember who your customers are, and are they going to want to receive all of this marketing? You don't want to annoy your customers. So use it carefully, and make sure you're not overburdening somebody's inbox because you'll just be annoying. So make sure you have those permissions if you need them. Give people the option to opt out and don't overuse it.
And I have another question I've just thought of, which is that let's say that you're not planning on sending any emails or doing any marketing. Do you then have any reason to hold a customer's data? Or should you, in that case, just not keep it?
Well, it depends on what type of business you're running. So, for example, if you're a psychologist and you're providing psychology services online, then there might be a reason why you need to keep hold of, for example, your therapy notes in case, because I think there's legal requirements to hold information about children, for example, and their health until they reach the age of 25. So in that case, yes, you can definitely hold on to it. If you're running a website where you're just selling just actual physical goods, once somebody has received the goods and they've paid and it's been delivered and the time frame for a refund or a return has passed, then you don't really have a reason to hold that data. So technically, in line with the data protection laws, you should be deleting that data. So again, it all depends on the business that you're running and the type of goods or services you're providing as to whether you should or should not be deleting that data.
That's really useful. Thank you. So staying on the subject of marketing, I've heard of something called the CAP code. I don't know what that is. Can you tell us what it is, Claire, and if it's something we need to think about?
Yeah, so this is important if you're going to be doing lots of marketing and advertising. So the CAP code is a code that's been put in place by the Advertising Standards Authority. Again, that's part of the government. And it sets out guidelines for ensuring that advertising and marketing promotions are carried out in a lawful manner. Now, the key thing to note here is that it is just guidance. So if you don't follow the guidance, you won't get a massive fine, you won't go to prison, nothing bad like that will happen. But the bad thing that will happen is that they use non-compliance to sort of name and shame people. So if you're not following the code and not complying with it, then they will investigate. They do publish their rulings and they use that to name and shame people. So it will mean that your business will have a bit of reputational damage. So it's not good. So most businesses do take the time to have a look at the CAP Code's website and to read the code. It's set out in a really clear way. It's just like little numbers and bullet points. But basically, it all boils down to common sense. One of their rules is to not be unlawful and to not mislead people. So, as long as you're running your business and advertising and marketing your goods and services in a sort of lawful, kind of honest way, then you should be fine.
That's really useful. Thank you. And now I'm going to throw out another word that I've heard of. What is PCI compliance? That's something else that I've heard of.
Yeah, so this all relates to taking people's money and doing payments online. So PCI, it's the PCI people have set up this Security Standards Council. I think it was back in 2005 or 2006, and basically it's a little council which has been set up to ensure that all companies that process, store, or transmit credit card information put in place a secure environment in which to do that. So, for example, if you're processing customers' payment details, you need to do things like put in place a good firewall, have proper password protections in place, encrypt payment details, and so on. Now this, bear in mind, this all applies if you are managing the payments yourself. But if you're using a payment processor like Stripe, or if you're using a platform that has payments integrated like Shopify or Wix, then they will already be PCI compliant as big organizations dealing with processing payments. So this will reduce your risk. So if you're using one of them, I wouldn't worry too much about this. But you are still ultimately responsible for checking your security procedures. So it's definitely worth reading up on it. Maybe conduct some little security scans on your website, make sure that everything is safe and secure. Top tips that people normally give in this area is to make sure, you have unique, hard to break passwords, that if your customers provide their credit card details over the phone, that you don't hold on to it, delete it. Pay special attention to roles and permissions on your e-commerce platform site. Make sure that people who absolutely need it have access to those admin roles and nobody else. And then people like Wix and Shopify, they often have things like two-step verifications and third-party authenticator apps and things to keep things safe and secure. So use those where possible. But yeah, I hope that explains it a little bit.
That does, thank you. I just have a few more questions, Claire. I did ask for some input here, so I've got sort of some questions now that may not seem like they follow. Okay. If it's okay, we'll work through them. The next question you might have actually covered already, because we've talked quite a lot about websites. Is there anything else, any other kind of legal documents or notices that we need to have on our websites to ensure we're compliant, other than the terms and conditions and the privacy policy and the cookie policy? Is there anything else?
So yeah, apart from those three, you would need some website T's and C's as well. So these will just sit as a little link at the bottom of your website, and they will apply to anybody who visits your website, whether or not they actually go on to becoming a customer of yours. And so this will have these basically are there to protect you. It will tell people that the content on your website is owned by you, and that people can't copy it. It will have things like, don't introduce viruses onto our website. It will have wording like, if we provide you with a link to another website, we're not responsible for that third-party website. And then if your website has lots of advice or, certain content, you might want to put a few disclaimers into your website T's and C's to sort of reduce your liability. So yeah, you definitely need those. They normally sit as a little link at the bottom of the homepage next to your privacy policy and cookie policy. So people normally have all three of those documents together at the foot of their homepage. Then, as you've mentioned, you have the T's and C's for buying the actual goods and services. And then the final thing that's worth doing, you don't have to do this, but it's worth putting a little copyright legend at the foot of your website as well, to tell the world that the content on your website is yours. So I think if you had all of those. Also, some people like to have their refund policy separate from their T's and C's as a separate link, because refunds and cancellations are a key term, and the courts don't like it when businesses try to hide key terms in their terms and conditions and their small print. So a lot of people, when they buy online, will just click that, yes, I agree to the terms and conditions little tick box. So your refund and cancellation policy is quite key. So it is advisable to have that as a separate document as well, even though it's a bit of a repetition. I would have that. And then finally, the other thing that a lot of people do on their websites is to have an FAQ section as well, which again could include some of the legal information, but it could also include information about, how your goods and services can be bought and all of that. So yeah, I would think about all of those things.
That's really useful. Thank you. This is a completely different topic now, Claire, so we can talk about something other than websites, which is, what about if you are working with influencers? So some of my clients and former podcast guests have done very well working with influencers online to promote their products. Yeah. Are there any legal considerations that we need to be thinking about, please?
Yeah, so if you're using an influencer, the first thing is to make sure you've got an agreement in place with them to set out, how they're going to be promoting your goods and services for you. But the key thing to remember here is that it is actually a form of advertising. And so the Advertising Standards Authority, which we talked about just now, they now say that you have to use the hashtag ad where an influencer is promoting your goods and services on social media. So make sure that they do that. And, in your agreement with your influencer, you should have a clause in there obliging the influencer to do that, and also to comply sort of generally with the Advertising Standards Authority and the CAP codes. Then I suppose, what else would you need to think about with influencers? You'd need to think about your target audience and whether the influencers' followers are aligned with that. Are they actually going to help promote your goods and services? And then you need to think about how you're going to pay the influencer. Will it be a set fee? Will it be based on commission, number of sales of the goods that they're promoting? Or some people pay influencers by just giving them some of your goods as the fee. But however you agree to pay them, make sure it's all agreed up front with the influencer. And then another little point, final point to note with influencers is that you might not want them to be doing any work with any of your competitors. So, if you're selling hairbrushes, for example, you might want to use a particular hairdresser influencer to promote your hairbrushes, but you might not want them to be promoting your competitors' hairbrushes. So you might want to consider having an exclusivity clause in the influence agreement to make sure that they don't do that whilst they're working with you.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So now I have a question about trademarks, which is, should we be thinking about trademarking our business names?
That's a business decision. So it's a maybe. You could not. It all depends on you and what's important. So a trademark, if you get one, if you have a trademark registration, you will be able to stop anybody else using the same or similar name for the same or similar types of goods or services. So if you have a trademark registration, it's really easy. You just whip out your trademark certificate, you can send them a cease and desist letter, and it's really easy to stop them. If you don't have a trademark, then you have to rely on the law of passing off, which is complicated. There's lots of things you have to prove. So I suppose, to answer your question, should I trademark my business name? The answer is, if you're worried that people are going to copy your name and it's important to you, then yes, get it protected. If not, maybe don't bother. Lots of people run their businesses without having their brand protected. But just a quick point to note here, it's really cheap. You only have to pay the Intellectual Property Office £170 to register a trademark. So it's definitely worth thinking about. But before you spend that money and apply, you do need to carry out some checks beforehand to make sure that nobody else already has the same or similar mark registered.
That's a good point, actually. I was about to ask that. So before you even start trading under a certain name, it's probably a good idea, isn't it, to check that there's nobody else, there's no other companies selling a similar product to you with a similar name to you, because presumably if you did, they could send you a cease and desist letter.
Exactly. There's three main checks you should do. First of all, just to run on just a bog standard Google search, just to see who else is out there. Then secondly, you can go onto the Intellectual Property Office's website and you can do a search for free. You just type in the name and you can select different types of classes of goods or services. So that will give you a check. And then thirdly, go onto Companies House and you can check for company names. You can see if anybody has the same or similar company name to you. It's always best to stay away from anybody with the same or similar name for the same type of goods or services. But obviously, if people have a trademark, they can't have that trademark for everything in the world. So, for example, HSBC, the bank, they have all of their trademarks registered for financial services. So in theory, you could set up another business using the HSBC brand. Well, actually, that's not a good example because that's a really famous mark and there's extra rules on famous marks. Well, take my business name, for example. So Aubergine Legal, I have that registered for legal services. So I could stop any other freelance or solicitors or law firms from using the word aubergine for legal services. But if somebody else wanted, if the gardening business came along and wanted to call themselves Aubergine Gardening, then I couldn't stop them from doing that. So that's generally how it all works.
That makes sense. Thank you. Just a few more questions, Claire. You'll be glad to know I'm getting to the end of my big list. So is there any kind of insurance or protection you recommend product businesses taking out? Because obviously we're all going to try really hard to be compliant with everything. Is there any insurance that can help us should we get something wrong? And are there any insurances we should have just in general because we're doing business?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, it's super important that you do get insurance in place because things do go wrong and you don't want your business assets, or if you're a sole trader, your personal assets coming under fire. So yeah, definitely get insurance in place. I would always speak to an insurance broker about all of this because obviously it's not really my area, but the things that you probably should put in place are, if you're selling products, you should definitely have product liability insurance. If you're selling physical goods. If you're providing services, selling services online, then you might want to consider getting professional indemnity insurance in place. And then it might be worth just having general business insurance in place as well. So, for example, that would protect if you had a load of stock and inventory, and it got damaged in a fire, that type of insurance would protect that. So, yeah, those are the three main ones. If you have people coming onto your sites, then you would, which probably doesn't really apply here because these are all online businesses, but say if you had a shop or you were providing services in real life, then you might need public liability insurance as well.
That's really useful. Thank you. And I think your advice to speak to a broker is really good because they will be able to advise you based on your business. But okay, so we need insurance. That's good to know. And my final question, I promise, Claire, is should we also be thinking about talking to an accountant? Because as well as states, when we're talking about staying compliant, I'm thinking it's not just the law, it's also there's also other things. So do we need an accountant as well?
Well, the short answer to that is yes, always. Always get an accountant on board. Especially if you are selling your goods or services outside of the UK, because there will be VAT and tax implications if you're selling services cross borders, which I don't know anything about, and I don't want to know anything about. It's not my area, but accountants will be all over this. If you're selling online, there's certain digital taxes as well. So yes, definitely talk to an accountant. Make sure you're doing everything properly, filing, on the right times, and there's certain thresholds when you need to be VAT registered. So yes, definitely talk to an accountant.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire, for all of this. Thank you for answering my big list of questions, being so patient, being so thorough as well. And I guess finally, I just want to reassure everyone that this isn't, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, Claire, this isn't as scary as it sounds. And the likelihood is you'll be doing all of this already.
Yes.
But it's just worth checking, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the key takeaways is just to have a general read around. I'll send you some links that people should be reading. And then the key things is, making sure that e-commerce purchase process is done correctly, and that you have those documents on your website. If you do all of that, then you'll be most of the way there of being compliant without even realizing it. So yeah, definitely don't worry.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire. So I'm going to link to everything you send in the show notes, and also your website if people want to get in touch with you if they've got any questions or have anything they need looking up.
Yeah,
and thank you again.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you so much for listening right to the end of this episode. Do remember that you can get the full back catalogue and lots of free resources on my website, vickyweinberg.com. Please do remember to rate and review this episode if you've enjoyed it, and also share it with a friend who you think might find it useful. Thank you again, and see you next week. If you've been inspired to start a podcast in 2024, I really recommend my podcast host, Captivate. Captivate were my top pick when I started podcasting 4 years ago because of how easy it was for a complete novice like me to get started. I've stuck with them for the last 4 years because Captivate is still really simple to use. They keep adding great new features like the ability to share ads like these, and they've just been really reliable. So when you're ready to start your own podcast, you can use the link in the show notes and get a free 7-day trial with Captivate.